Hi, and welcome to the Chapter 28 Key Concept Review. And in this chapter, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be going over some of the major concepts for the College Board's AP exam. And I'm going to focus on how it relates to Chapter 28, but throughout the lecture, I'm going to be comparing it. I'm going to be going over concepts that are general to this time period. And I'll talk about where information from this chapter fits into this lecture, and I'll be making some comparisons. So what you want to do is you want to be taking notes on a piece of paper, just making connections, right? Maybe having a map, either a map or a paper with different regions, and just taking notes on information that's new to you or a new way of understanding. You don't have to take notes on stuff you already know. And so the way the AP exam is organized, the information that's tested falls along the lines of major concepts. And so you'll be tested on concepts, and sometimes the questions might be about East Asia, sometimes they might be about Europe, sometimes they may be about Southwest Asia, or sometimes they may be comparisons. So you want to become familiar with these key concepts. So for example, key concept 4.1 is about the globalization of networks of communication and exchange. One of the major characteristics of this time period, of the time period 1450 to 1750, which we call the early modern era, is that the networks of communication and exchange became global. Prior to 1450, they were regional. There was regional trade in the Indian Ocean. There was trade along the Silk Roads. There were networks in Europe. There were networks in the Americas, but they were not all globally connected until the voyages of Christopher Columbus. So the interconnection of the Eastern and Western hemispheres marked the key transformation for this period. Technological innovations made this possible. So what makes the connecting of the two hemispheres possible is the ability to travel long distances across the ocean, and that was made by technology from before this era. Changing patterns of long distance trade include the global circulation of some commodities and the formation of new regional markets and financial centers in this period. Trade is going to facilitate the spread of religions and other elements of culture and large-scale migrations, some of those voluntary, some of them involuntary, like the slave trade. And we're going to see the global exchange of crops and animals and how they're going to alter agriculture, diets, and populations around the world. And we've been talking a lot about American crops in every chapter. So when we talk about the global circulation of goods, right, one of those is like silver. But how it relates to the Islamic world, agriculture provides the foundation for all Islamic empires. So the Ottoman, the Safavid, and the Mughal are all based on agricultural output. Food surplus is going to finance the armies and the bureaucracies of the Ottomans, the Mughals, and the Safavids. And empires are going to be built in previously active trade regions. Right? So this was the terminus of the Silk Roads, the Black and Mediterranean Seas, the Indian Ocean. So where these empires existed, it existed in the middle of these networks, as you can see here. Now, I'll show you on a side note, I'll just show you a little picture. This is also the region today that's in a lot of turmoil. So unfortunately, because of war and terrorism in the Middle East, we've seen some very ancient treasures be destroyed by war, and you can see before and after pictures in some of this. So this is one of the other impacts of war is the destruction of the human heritage. Now I talked about silver earlier, right? So you do need to understand the global impact of silver on Asian societies. We talked about the impact of silver on China, right? How China is wanting their taxes to be paid in silver, so their merchants demand silver from merchants. So in the Ottoman Empire, the way this impacts is silver was the basis of Ottoman currency and taxes as well. And the influx of silver from the Americas also leads to the devaluing of Ottoman currency. So since silver was their focus, when there was a lot more silver available, it weakened the Ottoman currency. And then it weakened the economy and it made them more dependent on European merchants. So the Ottomans, in order to continue to engage in trade, are needing to rely more and more on European merchants. So one of the things that happens in trade is when you depend on somebody more than they depend on you, they have the upper hand in negotiations. They get to take advantage of you, um, exploiting your weaknesses, and that's one of the factors that's going to lead to the decline of the Ottoman Empire. Another way this connects to this global key concept is how American foods become staple. Staple means it's the primary food you live on. And the Columbian Exchange introduces American crops to the Islamic empires as well. So European merchants introduced maize, potatoes, and tomatoes. In the Muslim world, we see an increased consumption of coffee and tobacco in the Safavid and Ottoman empires. And American crops don't have as a dramatic effect as in Europe or in East Asia or in Africa. Remember, in Africa, the introduction of like cassava led to the development of more agriculture and population growth despite the slave trade. The sweet potato in China, along with corn, the introduction of the potato in Northern Europe, all had very big impacts and led to population explosions. So even though there was an introduction of crops in the Islamic empires, the population growth was not as rapid. In India, the population growth came more as a result of intensive farming and not farming of American crops. And then Ottoman growth and their decline is attributed to gaining and losing territory. So when we see the population growth of the Ottoman Empire, it's more because they're acquiring more land or they're losing territory, not because they're farming more intensely. So understand that they do play a role, but not as severe as in other regions. So we could see the population growth between the Mughal. India has always been one of the largest centers of population in the world. Even today, 10% of all humanity lives along the Ganges River, the Indo-Gangetic Plain. So from the beginning of early civilizations, the earliest river valley civilizations, the biggest ones, were always the Indus River Valley and the Chinese river valleys. Okay, so that's why the Mughal population is big, because India has always had a large population, and even today, the two largest, most populated countries in the world continue to be China and India. And this is why, because they were already big. So when populations explode, places with already large populations are going to experience much more growth. But you could see the increase in Persia, not too much. Between 1500 and 1800, Persia doesn't experience a lot of growth. And then you can see the Ottoman Empire grows a lot from 1500 to 1600, then kind of declines and levels off a little. But again, that's because of losing territory, not because of other factors. Increasing interactions also leads to the spread of religions. And we see the spread of Christianity into the Americas when the Europeans go there. We see the Europeans attempting to spread Christianity into Japan and China. We see Buddhism spread into Japan and Neo-Confucianism. So we also see the spread of religion in the Islamic world. Sufi practices continue to be important, and Sufi mystics and missionaries continue to spread Islam. What we see happening here is we see more tensions within Islam. The Safavid rulers claiming to descend from Sufis and Twelver Shi'ism influencing Sufi thought is going to lead to the growth of the Shiite religion, or the Shi'ism sect of Islam in Persia. Political rivalries between the Ottomans and the Safavids are going to intensify the Sunni-Shia split. So as these two empires become powerful, you read about them in this chapter, the Ottoman Empire didn't want Safavid propaganda about Twelver Shi'ism spreading, so there was a conflict between the Ottomans and the Safavids. That's a conflict that had, already existed. The Sunni-Shia split followed after the fourth caliph in the by the 700s. There was already a rift in Islam, and that rift continues to the present day. Okay. So even in the present day, Iran and Iraq have fought wars. Iraq is more Sunni, Iran is Shia. So these political rivalries intensified during this period with the rise of the Ottoman and the Safavids. The Safavids began their reign by crushing Sunni religious orders, Shiite leaders pressured the Shahs to persecute Sunnis. So in Iran, in Persia, in the Safavid Empire, there was persecution of Sunni Muslims. And then the Ottomans, which were Sunni, detested the Shiite Safavids and again feared their propaganda. In the Mughal Empire, we're going to see Sikhism develop in South Asia in the context of interactions between Hinduism and Islam. And so Akbar, the ruler, who was a Muslim, supported the Sikhs, who combined elements of both religions in an effort to unite his empire. So he lent support. The Sikhs are more monistic. They believe in one spirit, right? Similar to monotheism. Akbar makes an effort to promote a divine faith that reflected Shiite and Sufi teachings. So in the Mughal Empire, because of religious tolerance, we see the growth of religions and then again the blending of beliefs, and Sikhism is an example of that, which actually I think the founder of Sikhism, his birthday was this week, yesterday I believe it was. He's one of the gurus, Guru Nanak. Another way this connects to the key concept is used in the world of the arts. Okay, one of the things that happens in the period of 1450 to 1750 is rulers seek to enhance their prestige through public works and projects. And we see this again everywhere. In China, the building of the Great Wall, the building of the Forbidden City. In Europe, using the money for trade in Florence to beautify the city, and how rulers would use art, like in court, to have plays and entertain people. In the Ottoman Empire, rulers also used their wealth for public works as a way of enhancing their prestige. So they attracted scholars, poets, artists, and architects to their courts. So the Topkapi Palace seen here in Istanbul is an example, right? And you can see all the artwork that, you're hiring artisans to come beautify your palace, but you're also using this, you're carrying out projects like this throughout the city to beautify your city and give you more prestige. There was innovations in visual and performing arts. Because of the increase in wealth, there's more money to spend. We talked about this with Asia and kabuki theater in Japan and woodblock printing, right? In the Ottoman Empire and in South Asia, we see miniature paintings as an example of how the wealthy people are using their growth in wealth from trade to fund visual and performing arts. So miniature paintings are really small paintings of rulers or of battles or of conquests. And we also see a lot of art in the illustration of manuscripts. So illustrating religious books is an example of an innovation in visual arts. Key concept 4.2, so we got 4.1, which is about trade and interaction being global. The second big concept of the period of 1450 to 1750 is the new forms of social organization and modes of production. And again, these are things that happen everywhere in the world. Productive systems continue to be centered around agriculture. Systems and location of manufacturing, gender, and social structures are going to be what change. There's going to be economic growth, and that growth is going to depend on new crops from the Americas and new commercial patterns. And that's going to impact the Islamic empires, as we'll talk about. And then political and economic centers shifted in many regions. So places that used to be important were no longer important, and new centers of importance emerged. Merchants' social status rises in many regions, and we studied this when we looked at China, how that's one region where it does not rise. But we see the status of merchants rise elsewhere. There was a little ice age. So something that happens during this period is beginning in the 14th century, there's a decrease in the mean temperatures. And that's going to contribute to the changes in agricultural practices and a contraction of settlements in parts of the northern hemisphere. So you could see from about the 1300s, we see a decline in temperatures, and that's known as the little ice age. So that's going to impact some of the developments, and that's why the cultivation of American crops is going to be significant and important. Another aspect of this key concept is there's a traditional, there's an increase in the traditional peasant agriculture. So in the previous era that we studied at the beginning of the year, we saw how peasants produced a lot of the food. That is going to continue and it's going to increase because in this era, there's going to be a bigger increase for agricultural goods and for luxury goods because of global trade. So the way this impacts the Islamic empires is we're going to see cotton production increasing in India. As there's more demand for cotton textiles in Europe, they're going to increase the production in India. So it's going to mean peasants in India working harder, more intensive farming in order to meet this demand for the European cotton markets. And since India had few peasants, they occupied huge tracts of land. And these are examples of Indian textiles there. So that's how this is, you could compare this to what we studied in China, how the increased demand for silk meant more people were cultivating silk. And since more people were cultivating silk, it impacted the mulberry farmers who needed to grow more mulberries to feed the silkworms, right? So this is something similar happening with cotton in India. Another thing that happens is we see the development of new social and political elites. So both imperial conquest and the widening global economic opportunities contribute to the formation of new political and economic elites. So throughout the world, because of the global trade, new groups of people are going to be prominent. So for example, in Europe, in the Middle Ages, it was the nobles who owned land who were the elites. But with the growth of trade, merchants, like people who own stock in the joint companies that we studied in Europe, those merchants became wealthier. Remember I talked about, like, I showed you a painting of a merchant with all the, in his workshop with his receipts and all that, right? They have more money than they used to. So that's an example of a new social elite. In the Americas, the conquest of the Aztec Empire by the Spanish places the Spaniards above the indigenous nobility, above the emperor and his descendants, right? And they have the criollos and the peninsulares. Those are social elites. In China, we have new political elites. In China, we saw the Qing dynasty, when they took over from the Ming dynasty, they made sure the people from Manchuria held a higher social and political position. So that's kind of the same concept. So that's something that's happening everywhere. And so we see this happening with merchants in India, and we see this happening in the Ottoman Empire as well. We see that with the rise of the Ottoman Empire, we have new political elites as they hire the Janissaries and they create this new system from the Devshirme, right? That's an example of new political elites. And then with the rise of new political elites, there are people who challenge the power. So the power of elites is going to fluctuate as they confront the challenges in their ability to affect policies of increasingly powerful rulers. So we saw in Europe how the rulers centralized power. They took away the power from the nobles by raising taxes and having their own armies, right? That's an example of consolidating power. Okay, and in this era, we have powerful rulers. For example, in India, the rise of a powerful Mughal empire is going to be challenged by the landowners who were previously in India, the zamindars. And the zamindars are going to resist Mughal rule in the Bengal areas. Okay, they lose power to collect taxes. The zamindars were kind of like the local princes. Remember we studied before, India was hundreds of little principalities. Well, they lost the power to collect taxes because now they still had to collect taxes, but now they had to hand those taxes over to the Mughals. So you see them lose power, and some people are going to resist. And then concept 4.3 is about state consolidation and imperial expansion. So empires are going to expand, but they're going to have difficulties in incorporating diverse subjects and administering wide territories. And that's something, again, all these are things that we see in all these chapters. Empires that are multicultural with different languages, different ethnic groups. We saw how there was conflicts with Native Americans in the Americas. We see conflict between the Qing and the native Mandarin Chinese in China. So empires and states of varying sizes are going to pursue different strategies of centralization. Rulers are going to use public displays of art and architecture to legitimize their power, right? So we've seen this before. So rulers consolidating their power using a variety of methods is something that's happening everywhere. And so here we see, again, the building of large royal palaces, like we see in Isfahan in the Safavid Empire, and we see in the Topkapi Palace in the Ottoman Empire. So the Topkapi Palace was the royal residence that you see here. And building something like this in the center of your city, right, attracts the attention, and people realize that you have a lot more wealth and a lot more power than anyone else. And again, that kind of instills pride in your city, pride in your empire. So we see the palace of the Safavids in Isfahan, right? This is the royal palace. In the Mughal Empire, that monumental architecture was seen in the buildings of mausoleum as well, right? So these are some of these are palaces and some of these are burials for rulers. So that was another way of legitimizing power. The Safavids, so one of the things we learned in common is that rulers had to legitimize their power. And we see, for example, in Europe, the absolute monarchs legitimize their power by claiming the divine right. In China, the rulers legitimize their power by claiming the mandate of heaven. So that's similar to the Safavid Empire, who uses religion, Twelver Shi'ism, to gain legitimacy. The Mughals built mausolea and mosques like this one, like the Taj Mahal, which is a tomb to the Shah's wife, or the emperor's wife. He builds her this burial. In the Ottoman Empire, the use of miniature paintings to paint the royal family and the victorious battles of the Ottomans. Those are ways of legitimizing power. And so you could see the inside of mausolea where they would bury rulers or members of the royal family, and these are big, elaborate tombs, again, to display your power, to show that you have, the legit authority. Another common characteristic that we see throughout the world in this era is because these empires are growing larger, they're encountering different ethnic groups and how they treat different ethnic groups differently. So we saw how the Qing Empire in China made the Chinese men wear long braids, didn't let them learn the Manchu language. We saw in the Americas how the Spaniards set up a caste system and they treated different mixes differently. So in this region, in the Islamic empires, we see them treating non-Muslims differently. Islamic empires do not force their subjects to convert. They conquer lands where they have multiple religions, but they don't force the people to adopt their religion, but they give them status of dhimmi, of protected people. So non-Muslims had to pay a religious tax known as the jizya. So as long as you pay that religious tax, you were allowed to practice your religion. Remember, Muslims see Jews and Christians as people of the book, right? And they give them that protective status, but they have to pay this tax. And in the Ottoman Empire, they allow for millet communities. Millet communities are communities that are able to have their own religious practices and follow their own religious laws separately. Again, so long as they're paying tribute to the Ottoman Empire, they could maintain their autonomy. So in the Ottoman Empire, they allow for religious toleration through millet communities. And that's an example of both religious tolerance because they're allowing the religion, but also of treating them differently because they have to pay a tax. So it isn't like they're free, right? Although they have those rights, but it comes at a financial cost. So that does represent a little bit of an oppressive view by some of these communities. Another similarity is the development of military professionals. Again, we saw the salaried samurai in Japan. We see in Europe how they the kings hired their own personal armies, right? No longer relying on the nobles. So in the Ottoman Empire, we also see the development of military professionals through the Devshirme system. That was the one that required the Christian boys to be taken from their families at a young age to become slaves for the Sultan, but they were trained as soldiers to become janissaries that were loyal, or they were given civil servant jobs working for the emperor. And eventually, so some of the families, the Christian families who didn't have a lot of money, sometimes they welcomed that practice. And the use of gunpowder made them more powerful. So that's something in the Ottoman Empire. We see another similarity in tribute and taxes, of having to pay taxes in land. And in the Islamic Empire, the lands are technically owned by the rulers. So people were given lands in return for tribute and taxes paid on those lands. And that's how they developed revenue. So the Mughal Empire comes in and conquers, and it makes the people pay a tax like I talked about earlier. Expansion relies on increased use of gunpowder, and that's why we call them gunpowder empires. So this is another similarity of this era. So everything I'm going over in this presentation is indicative of this time period, and this information is going to help you on the exam. Okay, if you remember these things, and you don't have to remember all in detail, but understand all these as characteristics of the period from 1450 to 1750, and one of those is the building of empires with the use of gunpowder. So the Ottoman janissaries implemented the use of new military technologies as the Ottomans expanded. And the use of cannon and gunpowder is what allowed them to finally break the walls of Constantinople and topple the Byzantine Empire. And you can see in this map here, this map shows the Ottoman expansion. And as you look at the map, you can see how between 1326 and 1534, it's going to grow larger and larger. And the military is going to rely on religious warriors, which are known as Ghazi, who joined because of the promise of land and because of the janissaries. So when you compare what was important in the building of empires in all of these regions, it's gunpowder. And because of that, the land empires are going to expand in size. So the Mughal Empire is going to grow bigger. The Ottoman Empire, like I just showed you, grows bigger. So here you see the animated map showing how the Mughal Empire grows, from, we'll get to as it moves forward, right? So from the 1500s, you can see it grow and grow. Here's Akbar's empire, and then how he expands it under Shah Jahan, and then under Aurangzeb. But remember, he doesn't practice religion tolerance, and it begins to break apart. And then by the 1700s, the Europeans are more in charge, and the British are growing in power. And that's why you see that power decline. And then there's challenges to state consolidation and expansion. So competition over trade routes, state rivalries, local resistance, all are going to provide significant challenges to state consolidation. So in the case of the Islamic world, so there's competition over trade routes. The Omani-European rivalry in the Indian Ocean. So Omani merchants from Oman, which is on the Arabian Peninsula, those merchants had long been powerful on the monsoon wind trades in the Indian Ocean, and the arrival of European with their gunships and the creating of European trading posts on East African coasts on the Indian Ocean is going to lead to competition, and it's going to lead to the growth of European power and a little bit of the decline of Omani power, but you're going to see these rivalries take place. You're also going to see the trade routes in the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic develop, and that's going to shift trade away from the overland routes. And then finally, the Ottoman-Safavid conflict is an example of a state rivalry that's going to have an impact, and we talked about this before, again, over the Sunni and the Shia. So what I went over in this presentation is an example of how there are general developments to an era that are happening all over the world, and we zeroed in on how they relate to this chapter and how it compares to other developments. And that kind of skill and that kind of thinking is going to help you when you have to write comparison essays, when you have SAQs that are based on the skill of comparison, or when you see questions. And you're going to see some questions on the exam that you're going to take for this unit that dealt with some of these topics. Okay? So I hope you found that helpful, and if you have any questions, bring them up in class, and I will see you there.